When you hear the word alchemy, you probably picture a medieval wizard in a dark, dusty tower, right?
Yeah, hunched over a bubbling cauldron.
Exactly, trying to turn literal lead into gold. But what if the ultimate alchemical laboratory isn't some, archaic setup of glass tubes and fire? What if the laboratory is the tightness in your lower back, the shallowness of your breath, and, well, the tension you're holding in your jaw right now?
I mean, it completely reframes how we experience our own physical existence. We stop looking for a magical transformation outside of ourselves and start looking closely at the uncomfortable sensations we usually just try to numb.
Right. And that internal laboratory is exactly what we are exploring today. So we have our hands on an incredibly dense, fascinating, and honestly pretty provocative manual. It's called The Alchemical Body, a manual for the transmutation of flesh into gold by Max and Claude.
It is quite the read.
It really is. And the mission of our deep dive today is to extract the most potent, life-altering nuggets from this text. We are going to translate ancient mystical metaphors into a highly practical blueprint for, hacking your nervous system, undoing chronic tension, and becoming profoundly well-informed about the vessel you actually live in.
Which is something we all desperately need.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. The foundational premise of this book is that the lead, meaning our modern, exhausted, stressed out, chronically tight bodies, can actually be transmuted into gold, which the authors define as a state of vibrant, integrated awareness. And you do this not through extreme action, but through extreme attention.
Right, which is a massive paradigm shift for anyone raised in modern fitness or wellness cultures. I mean, we are heavily conditioned to believe that physical transformation requires extreme action.
Like running a marathon.
Exactly. Or lifting heavier weights, forcing the body into submission through sheer willpower. But this text argues that violence against the body, even in the name of health, doesn't yield gold. It just creates a different kind of armor. Yeah. Tenderness and extreme curious attention are what actually catalyze change. But, before you can transform the body, you have to actually locate yourself inside it.
And that brings us to this fascinating concept the book calls the uninhabited body. The authors argue that most of us live in about 15% of our house.
Only 15%?
Yeah, specifically right behind our eyes and our forehead. That is where you think you exist. Everything below the neck is basically ignored until it shouts at you in pain.
And the text frames our modern epidemics, things like chronic lower back pain.
We just want to arrive at the destination. But the book lays out this map of common patterns to show how ignoring those bumps actually wrecks the car over time. They talk about the frozen armor of the pelvic bowl, which physically holds unexpressed fear and sexuality.
Yeah.
Then there is the protected heart and armored thorax, which physically restricts how deep you can breathe, and the constricted throat, which they call the bottleneck of the unspoken.
I love that phrasing, the bottleneck of the unspoken.
Me too. But if the body is this deeply interconnected web, it seems like treating an isolated symptom like, say, rubbing a sore neck is completely missing the point. The neck might just be the victim of a problem much further down the chain.
Exactly. And to understand how that chain works, we have to look at a concept the text leans heavily on, which is biotensegrity.
Okay, unpack biotensegrity for me.
So usually we picture the human skeleton like a stack of compressive blocks.
Yeah.
Right, like a stone column.
Yeah, the old shin bone is connected to the knee bone idea.
Right. And if your posture is bad, the assumption is you just need to force the blocks back into a straight line. Pull your shoulders back, puff out your chest. But biotensegrity reveals that the body is actually a continuous tensional network. Your bones aren't stacked. They're essentially floating inside a highly complex web of fascia and muscle.
Like a suspension bridge.
Like a suspension bridge, yes.
Yeah.
Or one of those geometric toys held together by elastic bands. If you have a primary restriction, let's say a tight psoas muscle deep in your hips from sitting at a desk all day, that tension doesn't just stay in your hips.
Because it's all connected.
Exactly. It pulls on the fascial web, creating a cascade of structural compensations all the way up your spine. You pull one thread at the bottom, the entire web distorts at the top.
So that chronic neck pain someone feels every afternoon might actually be originating from a frozen pelvic bowl that they've been ignoring for a decade.
Precisely. And the authors offer a brilliantly simple, practical tool to start unraveling that web. They call it the 3-second check-in.
Oh, let's do it.
Yeah, you can do this wherever you are right now. Just drop your shoulders. Let your tailbone physically descend toward the floor, which neutralizes that excessive arch in your lower back.
Okay.
And then let the crown of your head float up as if it were suspended by a string.
Wow.
Notice a difference. Those 3 gentle cues instantly begin to distribute tension evenly across the entire biotensegrity network, rather than jamming it all into your lower back or your neck.
I just did it while you were talking, and my chest immediately expanded. It's such a subtle shift, but the relief is instant.
It really is.
But, if that check-in just highlighted how tight your vessel actually is, how do you go about remodeling it long term? The book uses 2 primary alchemical operations for this process. Calcinatio, which is the burning or the fire, and solutio, the dissolving or the water. Let's start with the fire.
Okay.
The book points to breath as the ultimate internal fire, specifically emphasizing nasal breathing and the mechanical function of the diaphragm.
Right, because the diaphragm is this massive dome-shaped muscle separating your chest cavity from your digestive organs. When it's functioning optimally, contracting and flattening out, it pulls air incredibly deep into the lowest lobes of the lungs and simultaneously massages your internal organs.
But because of that tension web we just talked about, most people don't use it right.
No, they don't.
Mm.
Because of the armored chest and the tight belly, most adults are shallow chest breathers. Their diaphragm barely moves. Add mouth breathing to that, and you're keeping your nervous system in a chronic state of low-level panic.
Just constantly stress.
Exactly. Nasal breathing, on the other hand, produces a gas called nitric oxide in the nasal cavity. When that nitric oxide reaches the lungs, it opens up the blood vessels, allowing for much greater oxygen absorption. Plus, breathing slowly through the nose promotes alpha and theta brainwaves. It literally changes the electrical state of your brain from anxious to calm.
And they mention a specific way to measure your baseline panic level called the CO2 tolerance test. You take a normal exhale through your nose, pinch your nose, and time how long you can comfortably go before you feel the first distinct urge to breathe.
Right.
The book says if you're under 10 seconds, it indicates severe sympathetic activation. Basically, your nervous system is stuck in fight or flight. Oh, wait, hang on a second. I have to push back here.
Okay, go for it.
Isn't carbon dioxide the bad stuff? It's the toxic waste gas we are trying to expel from our bodies. Why on earth would we want to build a tolerance to a waste gas?
I know, it is totally counterintuitive because we're taught from childhood that oxygen is the hero and carbon dioxide is the villain.
Exactly.
But biologically, the primary urge to breathe isn't actually driven by a lack of oxygen. It's driven by the buildup of CO2 in your bloodstream. You have chemoreceptors in your brainstem that act like smoke detectors, sounding the alarm when CO2 rises. So if you have a low tolerance for CO2, those alarms are incredibly sensitive. They go off prematurely. So you start breathing rapidly and shallowly all day long just to keep your CO2 levels unnaturally low, which your nervous system interprets as a constant state of emergency.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah. By building your CO2 tolerance through controlled breath holds, you are essentially recalibrating those smoke detectors. You are training your brainstem that it is perfectly safe even when stress hormones are present.
So you're basically raising the threshold for panic.
Exactly.
Okay, that mechanism is fascinating. Another major component of the fire process they discuss is finding your edge in physical practice and engaging in something called TRE, or trauma release exercises, essentially deliberate shaking.
Right. Think about how a dog reacts after it gets into a scuffle at the park or gets spooked by a loud thunderclap. Immediately afterward, they will do this vigorous, full-body shake from their nose down to their tail.
Yeah, and then they just trot away, completely relaxed, like the traumatic event never even happened.
Exactly. That is a deeply ingrained, natural mammalian reset mechanism. When a mammal experiences a threat, the body floods with adrenaline and cortisol, preparing to fight or flee. If that physical action isn't fully expressed, that massive surge of chemical energy stays trapped in the nervous system.
Wow.
Shaking is the biological mechanism to physically discharge those stress hormones and complete the stress cycle. But humans have completely socialized ourselves out of it. We think shaking looks weak or crazy or unhinged, so we suppress the urge.
Right, you'd look like a weirdo shaking in the grocery store.
Yeah, exactly. But the text argues that this suppressed chemical energy gets trapped in our fascial web as chronic tension. Deliberately allowing the body to shake, to vibrate, physically burns through that frozen armor. It completes the biological cycle. That is the true fire of calcinatio.
But if you just burn through your tension with intense breathwork and shaking, you're left with raw, exposed nerves. The body needs to integrate that release, which requires yielding. And that brings us to the water element, solutio.
Yes, the water is crucial.
The text talks about yin yoga, where you hold stretches for 3 to 5 minutes. And they are very specific about that time requirement because they aren't targeting muscles, they are targeting fascia.
Right, because fascia behaves a lot like a non-Newtonian fluid. Think
Mhm.
of silly putty.
Yeah.
If you pull silly putty quickly and forcefully, it snaps in half. That is how most people stretch. They yank on their muscles for 30 seconds and wonder why they aren't getting more flexible.
Hmm.
But if you take that same silly putty and apply a very gentle, sustained pull over a long period, it melts and stretches endlessly.
That is a great visual.
Yeah, fascial tissue requires 3 to 5 minutes of passive yielding to actually reorganize its structure. It cannot be forced.
They also explore water immersion, specifically sensory deprivation float tanks, to achieve this dissolving effect.
I-
And the mechanism they describe is wild. The brain uses a massive amount of its daily neurological bandwidth just calculating gravity, a process called proprioception.
It takes so much energy.
Right. It's constantly figuring out where your limbs are in space to keep you from falling over. When you float in perfectly skin temperature salt water, you completely remove the load of gravity. The brain suddenly has all this freed up processing power, which it immediately redirects inward to process trapped somatic trauma.
It's incredible.
They even mention the literal practice of tears to release frozen emotional water. So fire is the intense breath hold or the vigorous shaking that burns down the old rigid structures. But water is the long yielding yin stretch or the float tank or the deep guttural cry that washes the debris away. You push, then you allow.
And if you skip those water practices, you just end up burning yourself out. You deplete your adrenal system because you are constantly activating and never integrating. The water practices return the nervous system to a fluid, receptive state.
Okay, so once the physical structures are aligned by gravity and the fascial web is cleared by the balance of fire and water, what is actually flowing through the pipes? This is where the manual transitions from gross anatomy to the subtle dimensions.
The invisible anatomy.
Right. The text maps out an invisible anatomy of the central nervous system, the central channel, Sushumna, the left lunar channel, Ida, and the right solar channel, Pingala. They describe a foundational practice called the microcosmic orbit.
Yeah, where you visualize and eventually physically feel energy moving up the spine on the inhale and flowing down the front of the body on the exhale, anchoring it in the lower belly.
But here's where it gets really interesting, because they have an entire chapter on the primary fuel source for this orbit, which is the sexual fire. The authors ask, how does Eros act as an alchemical fuel?
It's a provocative question.
Very. They argued that the reproductive drive is the most potent biological energy a human being possesses, but they argue against the two extremes of our culture. Repression, pretending the desire isn't there.
Yeah.
And mindless discharge, treating it just as a way to blow off steam. Instead, they advocate for sublimation.
Which totally challenges the dominant modern view of arousal as purely a release valve. Like tension builds up, you release it through orgasm, you feel relaxed, you go to sleep. But the text asks us to look closely at the biological realities of that cycle. Typical ejaculation, for example, triggers a massive surge of the hormone prolactin alongside a significant drop in dopamine. That neurochemical combination is what causes the sharp drop in motivation and energy immediately afterward. It also results in a significant depletion of minerals like zinc. Biologically speaking, creating the conditions for reproduction is a massive expenditure of the body's internal resources.
And the manual asks, what if you didn't expend those resources? What if you kept them? The practice they describe is intense. It involves bringing arousal to about 70 or 80% of the maximum and then stopping all external stimulation. Then you use a slow, deep inhale along with a physical contraction of the pelvic floor, what yogis call the root lock, to physically draw that intense neurological energy up the spine, feeding the brain and the central nervous system rather than discharging it outward.
Yeah. The Tantric and Taoist traditions have claimed for centuries that cultivating and recirculating this specific neurochemical cocktail leads to extraordinary full-body vitality.
It's fascinating.
From a biological perspective, you are taking the raw, creative power designed for human reproduction and turning it inward to reconstruct your own cellular health and consciousness.
Yeah.
You are essentially fueling your own nervous system's evolution with the body's most primal, high-octane energy.
It's a completely different way of relating to your own biology. But, of course, cultivating all this glowing, subtle energy while sitting alone in a quiet room on your meditation cushion is one thing.
Right.
It's easy to feel like an enlightened master when the room is silent. But the universe always tests the gold. What happens when the internal process stalls out, or when other people get involved? This leads us into the final phase of the book, the crucible.
The crucible begins with what the alchemists called the negrito, the blackening, or the dark night of the soul, specifically a phase they termed the head of the crow.
The head of the crow. Think about a time you started a new habit, maybe a meditation practice or a new workout routine. For the first 2 weeks, you feel amazing. You're riding the high of novelty.
Oh yeah, the honeymoon phase.
Exactly. But then week 3 hits and suddenly you feel completely empty. The breathing exercises that used to bring you peace now just make you feel like you're hyperventilating. The yoga feels like a tedious chore. You feel like you haven't just stalled, you feel like you've actually regressed.
It's so frustrating when that happens.
Right. When you hit a wall like that, the instinct is just to quit, to assume the practice is broken or you are broken. So how does the book justify pushing through that exact moment of intense deadness?
Because that moment of deadness is exactly where the false gold is burned away. The false gold is ego-driven spiritual ambition. It's the secret belief that I am doing these breathing exercises and holding these stretches so that I can become a superior, glowing, perfect human being.
Right, it's transactional.
Exactly. The Dark Night intentionally strips away all the neurological rewards. It forces you to continue practicing without the carrot of a peak experience. It teaches you to sit with your body simply because it is the vessel you inhabit, not because it's giving you a dopamine hit. It is the ultimate test of surrender.
Wow. And if the dark night is the internal test, the external test is relationships. The text calls intimate partnerships the ultimate crucible. It argues that romantic partners trigger our deepest, most primal infant attachment wiring. Your partner isn't the obstacle to your peace. They are the mirror revealing the exact unhealed structural pattern inside of you.
It makes perfect sense.
It really does. Solo meditation is like shooting free throws in an empty gym. I hit 10 in a row, the gym is quiet, and you feel like an absolute master of the sport. But an intimate relationship, that is game 7 of the finals, the crowd is screaming and you have a defender right in your face, that is where you see if your mechanics actually hold up under pressure.
The ultimate goal of the alchemical tradition was never to become a hermit isolated in a cave. It was always integration into the world. The true measure of a free diaphragm and an open heart isn't how deeply you can breathe on a perfectly heated yoga mat with ambient music playing. The true measure is how you breathe when your partner misunderstands or criticizes you. In that exact moment of conflict, do you instantly armor your chest? Do you restrict your throat to hold back your words? Do you retreat back up into the 15% of the house behind your eyes?
Or can you stay grounded in your pelvic bowl, keep your belly soft, breathe slowly through your nose, and remain present in the fire?
Exactly.
So let's pull this vast, intricate map together. We started by checking our structural biotensegrity, dropping our shoulders, and neutralizing our pelvis to inhabit more than just 15% of the house. We explored the fire of recalibrating our nervous system's panic response through CO2 tolerance and shaking like a dog to physically discharge trapped adrenaline. We balanced that with the water of yielding to gravity and long yin stretches to melt dense fascia. We looked at the profound biological shift of circulating sexual energy up the spine instead of discharging it, and we faced the absolute void of the dark night of the soul and the mirror of our romantic relationships. But the ultimate revelation of this entire manual, and it is a beautiful paradox, is that at the end of all this intense, extreme attention, there is nothing to achieve.
It really is the ultimate cosmic joke of the entire alchemical process.
And I want to speak directly to you listening right now because this is the core thesis of the manual. You are not trying to become something you are not. That lead you feel right now, the tightness in your jaw, the anxiety in your chest. It was gold all along.
Yes.
It had just forgotten what it was beneath layers of chronic tension, shallow breathing, and unexpressed emotions. The alchemical work isn't about fabricating some alien superior version of yourself. It is merely a process of recognizing your inherent nature. The gold is already there. You are just polishing it.
When we truly integrate that idea, it shifts our entire relationship with discomfort. And I'll leave you with this final thought to mull over. If your physical body is already the ultimate philosopher's stone, and the lead of your daily suffering, your anxiety, your tightness, is just the gold knocking loudly on the door of your awareness, what happens to your perception of physical pain? Or even the process of aging?
Wow.
Right? If a tight jaw or an aching lower back isn't a mechanical malfunction to be immediately medicated away, but is simply the raw material waiting for your extreme attention, how does that entirely change the way you wake up tomorrow morning?
A completely different way to live in the house. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into your own internal laboratory. Remember, the work never truly ends. There is no finish line to cross, but the work itself is the way home. Keep paying extreme attention to the bumps in the road, and we'll see you next time.